are live.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call the Special Finance and Infrastructure Committee meeting to order. With that, we ask Rachel to take attendance, please.
Morning, thank you. Chair Balducci.
Here.
Regent Santiago.
Here. Can we, whoever's calling in, can we ask that person to mute? We're getting a lot of road noise.
Sounds good. Regent Stewart.
Here, hi, hello, here.
Me. Regent Yang. That may have been him on the call.
That's me on the road noise. I'm here.
Thank you. Chair Gui.
Present.
Welcome to our ex officio, Charlene Casamento and Professor Cunningham and Chancellor Chang. Welcome. Professor Susanker as well. Welcome all of our CSU staff online as well. And Chair Balducci, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much for that. We have only one action item today, and it looks like it should be relatively easy. It's reinstatement of student services at the Connecticut State Community College. Is President Meduco? President Meduco, you're there. I would like to just turn this over to you for a quick, for a explanation, please, if that's okay with you. You accept?
Absolutely. Good morning, Chair Balducci, Regent Stewart, Chair Gui, Chancellor Chang, Regent Santiago, Regent Yang, and esteemed colleagues. John Meduco, CT State President. I am joined by our Vice President of Finance and Administration here at CT State. And before you, and you should see on the screen, is our overview and presentation regarding the restoration of student-facing services here at CT State. Carrie, next slide. So as you know, we are the largest institution of higher education in the state of Connecticut. We serve nearly 70,000 students on an annual basis. We have 23 locations. We serve about 25% of all undergraduate students here in the state of Connecticut. So we are a eclectic and nuanced and complicated organization simply due to our sheer size, volume of people we serve, and our locations that are peppered across the great state of Connecticut. Carrie, next slide. So back during the special Board of Regents meeting in August, a resolution was passed directing CT State and myself to develop a plan to restore student-facing services, specifically those services that were impacted by the FY24 and FY25 deficit mitigation plan. As we all remember, back during the special board meeting on November 15th of 2023, the Board of Regents approved CT State's deficit mitigation plan that aimed to address our then $33.6 million deficit. Per the resolution to restore student-facing services, we were also charged to ensure that the plan prioritized key student services across 7 categories. These categories being library hours, tutoring services, disability services, academic advising and counseling, mental health and wellness, wraparound support such as food pantry, transportation, childcare, and last but not least, emergency student funding. Carrie, next slide. As you know, like all of our CSU institutions, we are huge proponents of shared and participatory governance. And shared governance is also one of the 9 standards per NECHI, our accreditor. So we take it seriously in terms of ensuring there is the engagement across CT State. So within our plan, we also ensured that it aligned with our strategic priorities and goals. Those priorities being teaching and learning, public safety, DEI, and others. Additionally, we wanted to ensure there was an element of the student voice, and I can speak to, we have to do a better job putting the student voice at the forefront of all of our planning and engagement. But we have leveraged a holistic student support survey for 2+ years now. So this survey is issued during the long semesters of fall and spring. And we survey our student body to kind of learn about who they are in terms of their demographics, the modes of transportation they use to get to our campuses and locations, whether or not they have access to technology, whether or not they have mental health, wellness needs, whether or not they are employed, whether or not they are providing childcare or some type of care to someone. So it gives us a snapshot on who we serve. It's been a very powerful tool to allow us to take that data, that information, and cross-reference it with the very services that we're providing across CT State. We recognize that no two academic years are the same. So each year, it's a different makeup of students that afford us the opportunity to provide services and academic offerings to them. Like I mentioned, shared and participatory governance. So here at CT State, we have a statewide college senate. It's led by Professor L. Vandermark, who's a professor of history out of our CT State as Nantucket campus. And the senators are elected. So we have elected representatives from all of our locations, and we have at-large senators as well. Additionally, we have a timeline for implementation. We've identified the funding source for our plan, and this is transparent. So in terms of transparency, we have created a transparency website that's been live for a couple of weeks now, and it provides every facet of this process. So the level of engagement that took place across our campuses and between our stakeholders, the submissions from our campuses per this restoration plan, the letter or the request from our union in terms of what they deemed should have been submitted, and the process by which we vetted what was approved and included in the plan. Carrie, next slide, please. So in terms of developing the plan, we charged our campus leaders to engage with their local stakeholders to ensure that they were identifying the student needs and then do their best to prioritize what those needs were. We gave a deadline of the 27th of September for the initial recommendations from our locations to be submitted to Carrie Kelly, our Vice President of Finance and Administration. So her and her division of leaders can start to analyze and cost each of those recommendations. Like I mentioned, I haven't mentioned, our provost, our acting provost, Dr. Karen Hynek, her and her team, they surveyed the hours of operations of our student-facing services by campus and satellite location to give us an idea on when we actually provide these services. So often when people think about CT State, they think about our 12 campuses. We also have north of 10 to 11 satellite locations, right, where students can also access academic offerings and trainings, right? So we wanted to be comprehensive in terms of what does student-facing services look like across the CT State enterprise. And then lastly, in partnership with our college senate, we submitted our plan for their review, both at their finance committee, but also to the full college senate. We submitted our plan for discussion and debate. It was lively. I received an earful from our college senate. I received an earful from our stakeholders across our campuses. This is not perfect. And there were pain points and concerns about how stringent the process was in terms of those seven categories that I mentioned earlier. Carrie, next slide. Like I mentioned before, we have our transparency websites. If you'd like to scan this QR code, it takes you directly to our CT State website, and it lists every facet of what we've done. It has the links to our college senate meeting. We record every college senate meeting, so the whole world has access to those levels of deliberations, the hours of operations of our services. We have copies of the plans submitted by our campuses, the updates and the process by which we developed this plan, documentation of stakeholder engagement, and copies of 2 years worth of our holistic student services survey. Carrie, next slide. Now, Carrie, I'm going to pass the baton to Carrie, and she's going to kind of break down in terms of what we received in terms of the requests across our campuses and the process by which we use to evaluate what was submitted to us. Gary, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We received 73 requests from the campuses, and President Madugo put forward 3 additional requests for a total of 76. The plan that we're putting before you today recommends 39 requests that we received. All of the requests were evaluated to affirm that they were directly related to the 24 or 25 deficit mitigation. So that was one of the requirements of the resolution. Additionally, we wanted to ensure that they aligned with the 7 enumerated areas in the board resolution as identified student-facing services. So in total, the 39 recommendations has an FY25 cost of 1.7 million, and that would annualize to 2.1 million thereafter. There are a number of other requests that we sort of stratified. You can see in the chart on the right, we categorized them. Either they were not related to deficit mitigation, meaning they were something new that a campus identified that they needed, or something that had been eliminated or not funded prior to the deficit mitigation exercise, or they were in another area, perhaps a custodian or an academic position that were not directly related to the 7 enumerated areas. Additionally, there was a 4th category. There were some items that were later withdrawn because they had been funded in the FY25 budget, or we found a way to fund it. For example, there was a career services position that met the other 2 criteria because it was related to deficit mitigation and it was one of the 7 enumerated areas, but the campus had secured grant funding. So we did not have to find funding here in the operating fund for that. So that's what category 4 represents.
And Carrie, let me add that in no way are we suggesting that the requests that fell outside what we deem were the criteria of the resolution for restoration of student services had bad intentions or lacked a direct impact to CT State and our mission and who we serve. But we just felt that per the spirit of this exercise, it fell outside to that. Now, on top of that, we've told our stakeholders that, we will conduct a mid-year budget process where, without the restrictions of this resolution, all of our locations or divisions or campuses can submit. We can include what was not included in this plan and also additional requests, and see if we are outperforming our revenue and our expenditures to really have a comprehensive look at, are there additional things that we can submit, right? So we definitely want to be inclusive and in what our stakeholders are submitting to us as they deem impactful and necessary from both a student support standpoint and an academic standpoint. Carrie, next slide. There were also presidential initiatives in student services that I felt were important to include in this plan. So my role leading CT State is not simply to say yes or no to things, but whenever there is maybe an unintended inequity that's created, I have a responsibility to make sure that we are equitable across our locations. So what does that mean? We are legally one institution. We're not 12 institutions, right? We have one catalog, we have one set of policies, and we have one student handbook. So what does that mean? Through the lens of a student, independent of a location, I should be afforded, right, access to certain provisions and resources and offerings. And when there is a disparity, it falls on me, right, to address those disparities and inequities, right? So starting with student transportation, we are appreciative of having the UPass program. So students that are in credit-bearing programs and offerings are issued a UPass where they can access public transportation right across Connecticut. It's a great program. We've had it for years. The challenge with that program is we have rural campuses. So for example, our Northwestern campus in Winstead, Connecticut, our Quinebaug Valley campus in Danielson, Connecticut, our Middlesex campus in Middletown, Connecticut, and also our Naugatuck Valley campus in Waterbury. There are disparities in terms of access and dependability when it comes to public transportation, right? So there is no dependent public transportation in Winstead, in Danielson. And if you live on the outskirts of Middletown, Connecticut, you cannot rely on public transportation to get you into the center of Middletown, where our Middlesex campus is located. And then for years, there have been disparities in Waterbury as it relates to our Naugatuck Valley campus and students being able to rely on consistent public transportation. So with that said, we've been in contact and in discussions with Uber for nearly a year on a pilot program where we could subsidize Uber rates and make that accessible statewide for CT State students. So for example, many of our campuses are opened till 10 p.m. So even Norwalk is open at 10 p.m. I believe Route 11 is the bus that students have to use to get to our Norwalk campus, right? The last stop of Route 11 in Norwalk is 9:11 p.m. So if you're a student on a Norwalk campus at 10 p.m., how do you get home? Right? So being able to provide Uber ride share opportunities, it gives an additional access and buffer for our students to get to and from our campuses, right? So Uber is excited. Uber's been working with community colleges and universities for over a decade. They've done the analysis in terms of ride share and the available rides across the state of Connecticut in conjunction with our campus locations, right? So that's going to be one element that's included in this restoration plan. The next piece is supplemental instruction. Supplemental instruction, also known as embedded instruction or embedded tutors, is a high impact practice that's been adopted across the country for years. And there's really strong data in terms of how it supports and advances student success. So our provost, through her analysis, has submitted a pilot program where we would leverage embedded peer tutors. So these are students who are academically successful and they're providing peer-to-peer tutor, to their contemporaries for that additional student success support in 25 sections of courses with high withdrawal and failure rates. We want to see if this pilot program will shift and impact positively, right? Reducing withdrawal and failure in these 25 section of courses. And then lastly, career services. As a result of this process in gathering requests from our campuses, we immediately recognized that there was a disparity in terms of career services across our campuses. So as Nantucket, Northwestern, Three Rivers, and Tunxas do not have dedicated resources associated with career services. Career services, again, is the connectivity to say you've done your academic work, but let's begin to prep you for getting the job, getting the internship, moving on to the next level. So I felt it was important that we addressed this gap and make sure that there's continuity and equity of career services across CT State. Carrie, next slide. So here is a breakdown. Carrie, you speak numbers better. You're like a robot. You speak numbers better than most people. So can you give an overview of the breakdown of where the request came from per our student restoration plan?
Yes, happy to. So because this is related to the FY 24 and 25 deficit mitigation plan, we tried to minimize the impact on students. For some campuses, they didn't have a lot of things that met these criteria to request or recommend. So I think you saw that on the table a few slides back. And so on the right, we've tried to reflect by dollars how the 39 funded recommendations break down into the 7 categories, but you notice that there's not all the categories reflected there, and that's because the underlying reductions made in the FY 24 and 25 deficit mitigation plan, we tried to shield some of these things from reduction, like disability services, like mental health. So when folks were asked, what do you need to restore in those areas, there were no cuts made in those areas that needed restoration. So this is the breakdown here on the right by percentage of the 39 recommended initiatives.
Thank you, Carrie. Next slide, please. So in total, and again, time is not on our side, right? So there's pressure that was mentioned by our college senate and our campus leaders in terms of it still takes time to implement. If this is approved by our full board, it takes time, right? So this plan assumes a December 1st implementation. The plan would, our FY 25 budget, and Carrie, you can break this down, but we experienced a surplus, right, of $4.8 million. And basically we will be requesting per the student restoration plan for the Board of Regents to increase our FY25 expenditures to the tune of $1.76 million, which is a total cost of CT State's Student Services Restoration Plan, and reducing our surplus down to $3 million. Additionally, in terms of the FY24 deficit mitigation plan, in terms of its net reductions, we believe that this plan restores approximately about 10% of the reductions when fully analyzed. Carrie, is there anything else that we're missing in terms of just this breakdown and our request of the funding to support our restoration plan?
No, President Maduco, I think you got the main point. So if you remember, the board finance committee adopted the budget, and at that time we had a projected $2.246 million shortfall. Subsequently, OPM provided $7 million to the community college for reserve for salary adjustments. So that caused us to have an FY25 surplus of $4.8 million. We're requesting that we have be given the authority to spend an extra $1.7 million to fund these 39 initiatives out of that $4.8 million surplus. And that would bring the projected FY25 surplus from $4.8 million down to about $3 million. We also hope that we can have all of these folks lined up and in place by December 1st. We're going to be, for any of the staff who would be put in place and hired, we're going to be hiring them as temporary staff for two reasons. One, it's very nimble and we're able to get them into position very quickly. If we have to go through lengthy search processes, we wouldn't have folks in place to serve our students by December 1st. Secondly, that gives us flexibility to deal with the uncertainty in the out years and how this would all annualize. So that would preserve additional options for us. And so we believe that this restores about 10% of the net $24 million in expenditure reductions that were effectuated in the FY24 deficit mitigation plan.
Thank you, Carrie. Next slide. And then Carrie, you can break this down for us.
Right, happy to. So as you saw in the previous slide, there were a number of things that we did not recommend at this time, but we certainly would acknowledge that they have a direct impact on student services. But they weren't in those enumerated areas, nor were they perhaps directly tied to deficit mitigation. And so rather, these are things that we would want to consider. We're putting together a process that coincides with the mid-year forecast that we provide to the finance committee and the board. We hope to use this annually as a way for us to assess where we are budget to actual, and for us to be able to restore things that are a high priority for the institution. So when putting together the FY25 budget, we took a current services approach, but we also asked all of the campuses to identify things that they wanted restored and or additional new strategic priorities. Unfortunately, when we were putting together the FY25 budget, we were only able to fund about 19% of those things, but we never said no to those ideas. We said, not right now. We hope that when we come to the mid-year in the budget, that we'll have additional capacity to readjust the budget. So we sort of put all those things on a shelf. We're going to add these things to it, and we're going to go out to the campuses again without the filters put in place through this process, without things having to be directly related to deficit mitigation of 24 or 25, and without the very specific 7 categories, and ask the campuses to identify other things that are priorities that we should consider restoring if we have the available funding. So all of this is happening right now. We're starting to put together those templates, and we're starting the conversations with our campus leaders and our budget team. We overviewed that last week with them and our cabinet on Monday. So we're going to be working towards this. This is all going to be happening in early January to coincide with the mid-year spending report that we make to.
And Carrie, I will add, some of those positions that we said did not follow the spirit of the BOR's restoration directive to CT State. For example, a chemistry instructor or a maintainer or a custodian, though maybe not meeting the spirit of this process, it still those roles impact students. I mean, we can make the argument that every role at CT State has some direct or indirect impact to students. Right? So we want, at the mid-year point, we want to be fair and more inclusive when it comes to those requests coming from our campuses. Carrie, next slide. So, thank you for your time. I will admit this was a very this was a challenging and complicated process. Not everyone at CT State was pleased in terms of this exercise, and they made that clear in writing and on record, and I appreciate them. But we did our best to not only meet the deadline of this resolution of the board, but to do our best to put our students first and support the needs as we can. So I thank you for your time, and Karen and I are happy to answer any questions you might have for us.
And we will. Thank you very much for that, John. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and I'll open up to the members. First of all, the emergency student funding, okay, it wasn't originally in there, the explanation. Is it needed? I guess, let me ask that. 1, 2, where's the money going to come from? And what will it cost? Do we have any idea? I guess the key is it needed right now, A, and B, where is the money coming from? Is it coming out of your budget, our budget, or elsewhere?
Carrie, go ahead.
Happy to answer, Chair Valaducci. So in the current fiscal year, our FY25 adopted budget, when including the additional support from the Reserve for Salary Adjustment account, our budget has a surplus of $4.8 million. We would be proposing to utilize about $1.76 million in the current fiscal year of the surplus. So we would be asking the board to increase our authority for expenditures by $1.76 million, and that would be reducing the forecast surplus down to $3 million.
I thought much of that emergency funding came from foundations within the different colleges, or am I incorrect in that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was speaking about the overall way we're funding the plan. You're right. Emergency funding in general has been funded by the foundations. And so those were not things that were directly impacted by the FY24 and 25 deficit mitigation, which is why we don't see a lot of things in those categories for restoration.
Okay, so basically it is the emergency. We haven't seen any yet or needed any at this point, but what you're saying is the foundations help out with that emergency funding for students. So we don't have to worry about that in our budget as we move forward. One of the other things you mentioned, and while it's fresh in my mind, you mentioned Ubers being used. Is that money being built in, and how much is that going to cost us? Do we know?
Yeah, so the pilot Uber program that recommended in this plan, we've budgeted about $250,000, $250,000 for a pilot where Uber would subsidize or basically reduce the current rates or standard rates in specific locations across the state of Connecticut. And this is a way to supplement our UPass public transportation program, though beneficial, and we appreciate there are inequities and disparities with that in terms of some of our campuses don't have access to public transportation, and many of our campuses are open until 10, and many bus lines stop running at 9 or around 9 a.m. and we have students that are stranded. So we want to see how this Uber pilot program can kind of supplement some of the public transportation disparities we see across our campuses.
Thank you for that. And one other question I think that I have deals with the tutoring services. Do you feel we need 10 tutors at this point? We also have student labor involved in that, but 10, is that too many? Is it not enough? Just a thought from you folks who are there on a daily basis.
Yeah, Gary, we can tag team this. I think 10 is a fair number. Remember, we are the biggest college in the state of Connecticut, right? So again, we serve 25% of all undergraduate students in Connecticut, 1 out of 4, right? We have 22, 23 locations. So tutoring continues to be a request and need from our students, but also from our campuses. And it does play a direct impact in terms of supporting our students and helping them bridge a gap as it pertains to their studies. And so I believe 10 is a fair ask of our campus. I'm sure they want a lot more, but I believe that's a fair ask. Gary?
Yes, and the proposal put forward for the supplemental instruction, the peer tutors, that would be for 25 peer tutors to be embedded in sections with the high withdrawal and failure rates. And so we would ensure that those courses and sections that we select are occurring across all of our campuses with a minimum of at least one per campus. Many of the folks who provide the tutoring are part-time employees. So we have a variety of models on the campuses and how we organize tutoring support.
Thank you. With that, I would ask if any other members of the committee have any comments or questions before I move adoption of this resolution. I can't see hands, so when does any other?
You've had
Committee Chair Balducci, you have hands up from Professor Cunningham as well as Professor Sasanker.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start with Professor Cunningham?
Thank you, Chair Balducci. My hats off to President Maduco and his team for putting this together on comparatively lightning speed. And it's been impressive to see you work through this effort. I just have two questions. I'm wondering if you could offer some reflections on the restoration percentages by campus. Are some above 10 or some below 10%? Just out of curiosity. And the second question I have is, did you look at all at the Department of Transportation's micro transit pilot program? Because that's a public sort of version of Uber that's been functioning through 2024, I believe. There's an app you call on demand for rides, but the state actually, I think, has a heavier hand in sort of managing that program. And I don't know if the rates are better or comparative, but I was wondering about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Cunningham, good morning, and thank you for that question. I'll start with the second question. We're going to continue our efforts and work when it comes to when it comes to transportation and securities for our students, right? During this process, we heard loud and clear of, there's been just historic disparities when it comes to public transportation. So even the UPass program, it's only for our credit-based students. It's not for our students in non-credit programs, and we serve anywhere from 10 to 15,000 non-credit students a year, right? So you have that too. It was made clear to me with our college senate, what about undocumented students and DACA students? Ineligible, they cannot leverage the UPass program, right? So there are subpopulations of students that are not provided access or the availability of these services. So I think as an institution, we have to continue to advocate and exercise all resources there. I've had preliminary meetings with the Commissioner of the Department of Transportation, and I will continue to do so. And I think that's thank you for the suggestion in terms of the current programs that they have. I think too, Gary, we'll tag team. I know we can provide better analysis. At CT State, in terms of our 12 main campuses, we tier them by size. So we have our large campuses, we have our mid-size, and we have our small. So, I'm sure it varies in terms of the impact of what this proposed plan would do to cut into the deficit mitigation plan. Gary, is there additional insight you can provide there?
Yeah, I'm happy to go back and do the analysis that you suggested, Professor Cunningham. When we set out to do deficit mitigation in FY24, we had an approach where we asked more of the larger campuses because they had larger budgets. So each of them had different targets that were assigned to them to achieve savings. And so it probably stands to reason that the campuses that had the bigger cuts probably have the bigger levels of restoration. But the mix that each campus came forward with to achieve those cuts was very, very different. And some things fell into these categories and some didn't. So happy to do that analysis now. And I think it's an important analysis that we'll probably do again in January if we have the ability to restore some of the other things that were impacted by deficit mitigation, but were outside these more narrow criteria.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Other comments? Professor Sasenka?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thanks. So I wanted to just kind of ask about, I know that what we're restoring represents about 10% of the cuts that were made a year ago. But I am sort of curious about the fact that we advocated for more money than the system was asking for, faculty, staff, et cetera, and received about 33 million more as a result. And a lot of the argument for that was around restoring precisely those cuts. But 1.7 million versus 24 million is a big discrepancy. So just wanted to ask, I don't think there's any illusion that CT State has all it needs. If it did, then this would make sense. But very curious about why the scope was so limited. Because I know the resolution did say to prioritize certain things, but it did not say to limit only to those things. So that's my first question. And then I just have a question for actually El Vandermark as chair of the Senate about why their sort of approval was, I don't know what the word was, provisional, I believe. So just those two questions. And will CT State have access to the rest of that money? I'd like to know.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sasenka, and good morning. In regards to CT State's share of what was received from the legislature during the last budget cycle, I know that it was a mixed bag because I know, Gary, I believe off the top we had to address the expansion of what was known as PACT in terms of our free tuition program. So I know that ate into that to at least probably $5+ million. In terms of the additional revenue, obviously, we're dealing with the overall surplus that we're dealing with, but Carrie, if you can break that down. But in terms of the narrowed scope, I own it, right? So I think it was asked yesterday at the ASA committee who made an ultimate decision of what would be included in the restoration plan. Oh, that was me, right? And I have to own that, and I have to own the good and bad from our stakeholders. And if you know CT State, our folks don't mince words, right? So I know I will continue to hear from our stakeholders about the things that were left off of this plan, but I wanted to be realistic, right? Because I know that at the original board meeting back in August, there were questions from our regions regarding sustainability, right? What do we do in the following years to maintain whatever is restored, right? So I felt I had a responsibility to be realistic, but that's where we're also going to conduct our mid-year budget approach to see what other additional needs from our campuses we can restore. Carrie, in terms of just the additional dollars and whether or not we're going to get that, I defer to you.
President Duco, I think you summarized it very accurately. The PACT program, the eligibility was expanded, and based on the Office of Fiscal Analysis summary, the fiscal note on the bill identified an additional $5.65 million of cost for that expansion, though it wasn't funded directly in the budget. When we spoke with the leadership at System Office and explained the challenge, we were able to get $5.65 million off of the top of those additional dollars that were provided in one-time funding to the system to support this important initiative. Because without those dollars, there's within available appropriations language in the statute for what is now known as the Marianne Hanley program, also free college, formerly PACT. So we would have to close the program to folks if we didn't have those additional dollars. So we were excited about the expansion of eligibility, but again, that was something else that had to come out of those additional dollars that the system received.
Thank you, Carrie. Any other comments?
I believe also too the second part of so Carrie, I think we answered the what we took off the top in terms of the remaining dollars. I would leave that to you and obviously Dr. Blanchard in terms of that piece. But I think the second question from Professor Sasenka was the provisional approval or adoption of CT State student restoration plan. So Professor Vandermark, if you want to touch on that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Professor Sasenka. I think that this is a complex question. And Senate was considering and reviewing both the budget as well as the plan to restore student services simultaneously. This was a really heavy lift. Neither of these things are clear. And so at the same time that Senate was considering this plan, we were simultaneously trying to figure out why wasn't a $14 million surplus from other expenses restored from CSCU to CT State and a more robust plan put forward. So senators asked questions both about the budget process, but also about the process used to vet positions. Specifically, there were concerns about the positions as President Maduco and Vice President Kelly already talked about, positions that were eliminated before budget mitigation. These were critical positions that were outside these narrow parameters. But there were also questions about the degree to which campus shared governance was used by CEOs. The sustainability of these questions, while we appreciate and respect and support quickly restoring these positions, as in hiring very quickly in a temporary capacity, there's significant concern about the long-term, the ability for these positions to be restored on a longer-term basis, and how a short-term restoration could actually harm students. And then finally, Senate was concerned that while we support the presidential initiatives, that these were put forward despite some of the other positions not being considered. So they weren't vetted to the same degree. Now, all of these concerns were still overcome with President Maduco's commitment to consider a mid-year review. But that shouldn't be considered as a wholesale endorsement. Actually, I think that the Board of Regents should hear these concerns, especially this $14 million from other expenses. That is desperately needed by the community college. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Professor Sasanker. If you have something more, I'm happy to try to provide more clarity.
No, it does. Thank you. And I think we're both very curious about the rest of that money that was provided for fiscal year 25 in advance of a budget year. What I think I hear as part of the answer from Dr. Maduco is that the uncertainty about long-term funding as opposed to one-time funding limits us in terms of the kind of hiring that you can responsibly do. And I hear that, I understand that. It would be nice if instead of dispersing our reserves, we could hold on to it in anticipation of more permanent funding in this budget year. And I don't know if that's possible or if it's being done. But you know, that's what I think I'm hearing, and I hope that there's an answer to that question.
Thank you. Other comments? Okay, I don't see any. With that, I would make a motion to move adoption of the resolution for approval to reinstate student services at Connecticut State Community College. Is there a second?
You get a second from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mayor. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Hearing none, the resolution's adopted. Is there any other business to come before this committee at this time?
Chancellor Chang.
Hearing none.
Hold on a sec. Chancellor Chang, did I see a hand up from you? Okay, thank you. Excuse me.
I would then therefore move for adjournment. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
A second. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye, opposed?
Aye.
Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Thank you, and congratulations, President Maduco.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Balducci. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Your live stream is stopped.
Where's that 14 million? Internally?
It's internal. I don't know anything